anxious that this sign need not be used. So I'm going to try and so wave at me, when I get that shut up warning. Okay, so we've already had quite a bit during the course of the conference, but rather tangentially in some ways. But this set of papers, or at least mine, is more centrally about the British New Left in its pre-1968 manifestations. And Dorothy Thompson, in 1996, wrote what was really quite a withering review of the two main histories of the New Left by Lin Chun and Michael Kenny. Many of the criticisms she made there, I think, are quite unfair, but one point that she does have, I think, correct, is that there aren't many existing histories or treatments of the New Left which capture the sense of the New Left as a political movement, rather than as just an intellectual tendency. So the first point I wanted to make, really, is that the New Left is and should be seen as something more than just its journals, fascinating, important, and interesting though these are, and I thought you might like to see a few cover images of the three constituent New Left journals. The New Reasoner, of course, and it's mainly the Reasoners that I'm going to talk about today in terms of their activism. The younger group are on Universities and Left Review, Stuart Hall, Charles Taylor, and so on, and then the merger in late 1959 to form New Left Review. So the ongoing research from which this talk is drawn tries to challenge some aspects of that existing historiography through a closer examination of the nature and the extent of New Left activism. And the particular focus is on excavating a kind of a neglected history, or neglected histories of a range of spin-off activities and activist initiatives that New Leftists of both generations either initiated, sponsored, or were involved in. So to give you some sense of the range of those, they go beyond 1968, but I'm only going to talk about the pre-1968 ones today. We're talking about things like the early Universities and Left Review Club, which later grows out into this Left Clubs network, the Partisan Coffee House, the Five Socialist League, Searchlight, which was a short-lived New Left industrial bulletin, the Centres for Socialist Education from 1965, that eventually morphed into the Institute for Workers' Control, the May Day Manifesto Initiative, the socialist newspapers Black Dwarf and then later 7 Days, Centres for Marxist Education, the Socialist Society, which was an initiative, a collaboration between Miliband and Tony Benn and others, and of course CND, but I'm not going to talk about CND because the New Left's involvement with CND is pretty widely registered and covered in existing history, so I'm not going to actually focus on that. But these other initiatives haven't really had very much attention at all. They were often quite short-lived and quite different from each other in nature and intent. Now, in terms of why this research, well, hopefully why I think it's interesting and potentially significant. Now, in general terms, of course, as historians, we want to add to the richness and the texture of our historical understanding about the New Left. But I think there's also elements of this research which to some extent challenge or extend the existing historiography. The first one is the aim to illuminate a kind of Mediterranean dimension of New Left history that moves the focus away from the output of key intellectuals and a largely metropolitan viewpoint, and particularly to acknowledge the really important contribution of, I think what the conference called for papers called less glamorous locales, provincial locations, and lesser known individuals. The other thing, and I think this is already being demonstrated in the papers that we had yesterday, and I was thinking a lot about this as I was hearing you all speak yesterday. The New Left is sometimes presented in existing histories as if often they're written mainly in terms of a kind of internal history about the conversations that these people and groups were having with each other and the discontinuities between the generations and between individual figures and the kind of spats between Anderson and Thompson and all of those things that we know about. And I think it's sometimes easy to forget that the New Left is actually enmeshed in this much broader web of left activism and labour movement activism and socialist debate more broadly. So I've been really interested and struck listening to the contributions that we had yesterday of how important that context is for these debates. And then thirdly, I think, and already started to do this in other work, I'm not entirely happy, well I'm not at all happy with the kind of two generations narrative of the New Left, which I think misses all sorts of subtleties and complexities. And there are lots of figures, Ralph Miliband is one, Raymond Williams is another, Stuart Hall is another, who don't fit at all really neatly into either of those kind of generational analyses. And so I think anything that kind of moves that on and disrupts that narrative is quite useful. And then more broadly, the issue that I want to try and get at a little bit, perhaps in this paper, is that we hear a lot about the New Left having failed, in inverted commas, failed to establish the kind of broad movement for socialism that it briefly tried to attempt. Thompson, of course, was very pessimistic, and he said that the New Left had failed to establish their purposes or even sustain their movements. And so New Leftists themselves have been quite pessimistic, in some senses quite negative, about their own record in terms of their record as a political or social movement. So Michael Rustin, for instance, says a social movement was what the New Left wanted to be, not what it was. However, I think we can and should look at this a slightly different way. If we look at the field of social movement studies, for instance, it's widely recognized in that field that, and this is a quote, movement organization is as much a cultural as a political phenomenon. And this cultural aspect of movement organization refers to how movements organize themselves symbolically to express their central goals and values and affirm their collective identities. And I think this kind of insight is very relevant to the New Left. We often are familiar with that sort of analysis when we look at the United States New Left. The analysis of things like the SDS, the American New Left in terms of what's often dubbed prefigurative politics or expressive politics. And history is there, and I'm thinking of people like Stephen Wachler and Weenie Grimes, terrible pronunciation probably there. They tend not to look at these movements in terms of immediate political successes and failures by orthodox standards. Rather, they think the importance of these movements lies, and this is again a quote about the American New Left, the movement succeeded in avoiding traditional obstacles and exploring an alternative form of organisation that created a valuable legacy for subsequent movements. So in a sense, that's what I want to try to extend and to argue about the New Left's organisational experimentation in this period, that while it may have failed, in inverted commas, in immediate political senses and in relation to some of its own goals and hopes, it does indeed create a valuable legacy for subsequent movements. And I've been particularly struck recently, reading more recent work, about legacies and continuations between what you might call local socialisms and other movements. So the specific focus of the paper that some of you may or may not have read or may now be flicking through online is efforts among the New Left to mobilise a working class constituency for its ideas in the decade before 1968. And the things that I'll briefly talk about in the paper, and we'll just take out a couple of examples for the purposes of this. How am I doing for time? I've done 10 minutes, or I've got 10 minutes? Okay, fine. All right. Are things like the left clubs, especially the Northern Clubs Network, the Fife Socialist League, this so-called New Left industrial wing that I'll talk about in a moment, it's more a hope than a reality, the Centre for Socialist Education and the May Day Manifesto Initiative. Those are the things that take us up to 1968. And in terms of contexts for that, understanding that in relation to the New Left, there are various ones. And I'm not going to go through these here. But the really important context, I think, that, again, as I said, I've been really struck by during the course of this conference, is both the persistence of the experience of Communist Party activism, and that of course applies mainly to the Reason Agreed. But I was struck yesterday, and I think Bart's presentation about generations, about the importance of these generational, these cross-generational influences. And even many of the younger universities and Left Review grouping, and of course the title was a reference back to Left Review, and they were very much influenced by the kind of communist levee of the 30s and the idea of commitment in politics and intellectual activism. So even that communist experience, the Popular Front experience, was an important influence even on those younger people, as well as the people like Thomson, Savile and so on, who actually had been through the Communist Party themselves, come out of it in 1956, and had been very much a part of that politics at the time. Obviously, the importance of those backgrounds were different to those groups, and they experienced and saw them differently. But nevertheless, there is that kind of continuity and influence, which I think is really important. Another thing that's been written about quite a lot in relation to the Reasoner group particularly is the importance of the adult education background, traditions of worker and adult education. It's no accident, it's very important to the story I want to tell here, that Thomson, Savile, Michael Barrett Brown, Tony Topham, Ken Coates were all adult educators. Sometimes from Communist Party backgrounds, sometimes not, but very much enmeshed in that kind of, I'm very committed to that, felt that that was part of their political commitment. In relation to the immediate context, in terms of the 1957 to 1961 or 2 period, insofar as the New Left was oriented towards the Labour movement and Labour Party, and it was to some extent, their goals were obviously the promotion of unilateralism, allied to an analysis of positive neutralism or active neutrality in foreign policy. There was their goal to resist the kind of prospectus of Cosmondite revisionism, and in particular, industry and society. There was an emphasis on recovering earlier traditions of humanist, utopian, and what you might call associational socialisms, and that was shared by both generations, if you want to call them that, in different ways. And there was this kind of, what I think Thomson called the New Left in its missionary phase. This idea that the problem was to go out and actually make socialists. And there was also a key concern with industrial democracy and later workers' control. In terms of how they thought about working class agency, I've talked about this elsewhere. In general, there was a strong commitment to working class agency, but there was also quite an interesting set of analyses, theoretically and politically, and a lot of open-mindedness towards narratives and agencies that would eventually kind of disrupt and challenge some of that, and particular alertness to the importance of culture. So that's just an image, I think it's an advert for a Universities and Left Review Club meeting, which shows the importance of the European dimension. And then the other thing that I found helpful, Brian Palmer, in an essay some years ago where he talked about New Reasoner, described it as having had this organisational impulse that was a product of the communist experience of those people, but that never completely went away. And I found that quite a useful idea in thinking about the New Left more broadly. And I think there were different possibilities and outlets for this organisational impulse. From time to time, the New Left was involved in efforts to actually sponsor or create some kind of pluralist, extra-parliamentary grassroots movement for socialism. And into that category, we could put things like some aspects of New Left activism within C&D, some aspects of the clubs network, certainly the May Day Manifesto initiative. The second kind of less prevalent outlet was what you might broadly call party organisation. And that continued to exercise an attraction, a pull on New Leftists, either through their pull back to the Labour Party, Labour leftism, through involvement in far-left parties, or less concretely in this aspiration to build a new independent socialist party, which is something that keeps cropping up through New Left discussions. You get it with Daly and the Fife Socialist League, but also later through Ralph Miliband, who remains convinced, even though he never thinks the time is right to set up such a party, he remains convinced that this is actually what needs to be done. And the last one, which is in many ways the most typical sort of form of New Left activism, and applies to all of the movements I'm going to talk about today, is the kind of outreach, propaganda and education type of initiative. And into that category, obviously, fall the Centres for Socialist Education, some aspects of clubs work, and some of these spin-off publications like Searchlight and later something like 7 Days. Now, it's not surprising that given the difficulties of sustaining initiatives of the first two types, or the failure to do so, it's the third type that proves the most persistent and is always there to kind of fall back on. And so that's clearly evident in the kind of story of this book here. So how long have I got? 5 minutes. Okay, so I think Lawrence Daly came up very briefly yesterday, and this, I think it's him, I'm pretty sure it's him. And a bit later, I think this is in 1970-71 rather than in 58-59 when he set up the Socialist League. There were efforts to set up some kind of northern industrial wing of the New Left, and Daly was a really critical figure in all of this. He's somebody, of course, who comes out of the Communist Party a bit earlier, in fact, than Thompson and Saville, who writes to the Daily Worker and to them in support of the effort to found the Reasoner, and who founds in 1957-58 this group called the Fife Socialist League. And the Fife Socialist League and the relationship between Daly, who becomes very close to Thompson and to Saville, becomes for this brief period the most important embodiment of New Left hopes for some kind of working class socialism from below, which is outside the sects, in inverted commas, generally independent and grassroots. And in a letter to Daly, just after his election result in West Fife, Thompson says, you know, this was totally worth it. He says, we talk a lot about the potentialities of working people in the abstract, but here one felt it in the concrete, and it's given me added faith in the real meaning and force of socialism, when people start acting for themselves from below. So the Fife Socialist League is relatively short-lived, but it does have some kind of electoral success, and it briefly creates this debate within supporters of the New Left around the reasons of whether it's permissible to stand candidates to the left of Labour and against the Communist Party. And it's the only instance of the New Left where they actually throw their support behind this, or at least the Reasoners do. Now the story of the League, and I won't go into it here, I do a little bit in the paper, illuminates a lot of the problems but also, and the limitations of New Left politics, but also some of its hopes and potentialities, I think. Daly, of course, himself, after he winds up the League in 1962-63, eventually goes on to General Secretary of the NUM. The second thing that I talk about a little bit in the paper is the Northern clubs, and this is rather a good image of the New Left Review battle bus, as I think it was called. Now, some aspects of the club's work, such as the Partisan, are relatively widely known about, but there's been very, very little written about the existence and the lives of the Northern clubs, and I've been talking to Jeff about this quite a bit, and the clubs in Manchester, Bradford, Leeds, Hull, Carlisle, all of these kinds of places, not surprisingly, were the location of hopes for this kind of Northern New Left industrial network. And the prime movers of that included Michael Barrett Brown in Sheffield, Ken Coates in Nottingham, Tony Topham in Hull, all of these adult educators, but it also included lesser known figures, or people that we know about for other reasons, like Trevor Griffiths, a playwright who was an important person in the Manchester Club, a group of Labour MPs, Paul Rose, for instance. So the Northern clubs feature really little, if at all, in writing on the New Left, and yet it seems to me at least that they're a really important avenue for further research into this. So far, I haven't done all of the primary research, or even half of the primary research I would need to do to establish a proper kind of history of this, but I've just so far got very broad indications of a sort of web of activism and personal contacts that were quite important here, through things like the Daily and Saville papers. And then the last thing that I'll just speak about briefly was the Centre for Socialist Education. Political context had somewhat changed by the mid-60s with Wilsonism, and there was a kind of regroupment of New Left figures with a sort of broader left in face of the radicalisation of the 60s, and one product of that was the Centre for Socialist Education, which is most identified with Ken Coates, but was also an initiative in which Ralph Miliband played a really important part. There's a rather good picture of Ralph Miliband looking rather less intellectual and more kind of louche than we tend to think of him. Yeah, looking like it as well. And this was kind of impelled by a sense of disillusionment with the retrograde direction, as they thought of it, being taken by the Wilson administration. And what broadly happened to the Centre for Socialist Education, of course, it's set up to service a network of educational activities in relation to the labour movement. And increasingly, this ethos of service and a connection to actual day-to-day struggles becomes increasingly important, and of course is particularly pushed for by figures like Coates, also Peter Sedgwick, who argue that the job of socialist education is more than just providing theory that workers are meant to learn from. Rather, this should be a two-way conversation. Now, what eventually happens to the Centre for Socialist Education is that there's a sort of bifurcation of interest, really. When Christian comes later on today, I don't think he's here quite yet, he'll tell you a story about this encounter between C.L.R. James and E.P. Thompson at the Coventry meeting on workers' control and industrial democracy, which is quite interesting and instructive. E.P. Thompson had come along there to advertise a new initiative, the May Day Manifesto initiative, which is much more kind of centrally a regroupment of New Left intellectuals. So what kind of happens is that the Centre for Socialist Education goes much more in the direction of industrial democracy and workers' control, morphs into the Institute for Workers' Control, and the May Day Manifesto initiative, and just a couple of images of that from that to close, does some of the same type of work as the left clubs had done, local groups, quite important in some kind of local struggles. Education and rents in Brighton, for instance, is one. But it's somewhat overtaken by the sort of harder-edged radicalism, the more revolutionary atmosphere of '68. So just 3 points by way of conclusion. What I want to try to do with some of this research is a little bit get over this bifurcation between this idea that New Left thinkers and working class activists and the New Left are totally mutually exclusive categories. I don't think that they are. I think there's a need for further research on these independent clubs and regional New Lefts, which I think is really useful and important work. And I think that this will show, when it's pursued properly, that the legacy of New Left activism actually remains quite an important resource for lots of contemporary movements that we don't necessarily know about and associate back to the New Left. Thank you.
Thank you very much.